Elon Musk's ideology and Donald Trump's ideology is very radically, let's say, Western. And this is why I put like in the bottom there, I put like radical Westernism. Because we often hear about the radical Islamic terror, the radical Islamic ideology or religion or whatever, right? As if being a Muslim involved ideology itself, and therefore you are prone to being violent because you are a Muslim. It is very Orientalist. It is very racist. Um, but it is itself, that viewpoint is itself the product of an ideology. This is something that maybe I can show it here to you guys. Let me return to this. I tweeted about this like sort of tongue in cheek here in this tweet. I think you can read it, right? Hold, let me double check if you can read it. Yeah, I think so. I think it's big enough. So in this tweet, I sort of tongue in cheek joked um, using the same tropes, the same language that they used to refer to the quote radical Islamic terror, and frame it in what would it feel like to frame the West in these same with these same tropes and arguments. Right, so the tweet says, this is sarcastic, okay? It says radical Westernism holds that white Europeans and their descendants are inherently superior to people from other cultures. And I think that is absolutely true. It's just not radical Westernism. Like the idea of Western values holds that, right? That Western values are superior to other values in other cultures. And the more closely you align to this, like traditional family values, Western individualism, white, um, ethics, Protestant ethics, Christian, worldview, the better you are as a civilization, right? This is Richard Dawkins saying that he's culturally Christian, right? So this is not really me being uh, embellishing things. This is fact, right? But anyway, radical Westernism holds that white Europeans and their descendants are inherently superior to people from other cultures, or at least their culture is, right? It is the violent result of a conquering people, because they usually accuse, Islam of being a conquering people because of the, expansion, the Muslim conquests of, the 600s and 700s Common Era, right? So it is the violent result of a conquering people that's responsible for countless acts of terror throughout history. Yes, the West has conquered a lot of the world throughout history, and in those conquests, carried out a lot of terrorist attacks. Right, the sack of the Kingdom of Benin was a terror attack, if you want to use this framework. Right? The massacre of indigenous people in the United States was a terror attack, if you want to frame it in this with this language. Um, and so I go on in the tweet, we must empower the moderate Westerners so that they abandon these backward ideas, which is the common trope that you hear, these like the new atheist types, right? Oh, we need to empower the moderate Muslims so that they abandon their radical Muslim ways and they can join the modern world, right? So, okay, then it would be the same. You would need to like empower the moderate Westerners, those that don't think that Western culture is superior to all others. Um, Otherwise, they will be incompatible with and unable to assimilate to the traditional post-colonial values of self-determination and anti-racism prevalent in the modern world. Yeah, because normally they say, well, Muslims cannot accept the values of like individualism and like secularism or whatever other value that you want in the modern world. So they are incompatible. They cannot join us in the modern world, in this like orientalized version of Islam. Um, and so in doing this, in writing this tweet, it sort of hit me. It sort of hit me that there is such a thing as a radical Westerner or a radicalized Westerner. like Elon Musk, like Donald Trump, like what we refer to as white supremacy or Christian nationalism. That is a radical ideology of the West is best, right? And that is something that I find um, interesting because it is that idea of the West is best that frustrated the Magdeburg attacker to the degree that he carried out his terrorist attack. Because he said, like, this is not what I was promised. Right? So Soniac825 says, my parents retired in the UAE, and any pro-Palestinian speech is banned there. They only pay lip service to Palestine and Islamophobia because they fear their population who supports those issues. Yeah, that is another thing, right? This idea of the radical Western way of seeing things um, has expanded throughout the world. Like, I'm from Peru. In Peru, there's very ideologized white elite Peruvians who are convinced that the problem that Peru has is that um, a large percentage of our population lives, to quote Mario Vargas Llosa, the Peruvian Nobel Prize winner, literature Nobel Prize, in the, I think he said, 17th century, referring, of course, to indigenous people. And that the only way that Peru is going to develop and attain modernity and modern standards of development is by, quote unquote, developing or civilizing, if you want to use more honest language, its indigenous population. So you have this way of thinking that comes from the West, this idea that West is best, that is being deployed violently in a global South state as a means to uh, advance this ideology. To the point where in like a few years ago, we elected a president. For the first time, a rural indigenous farmer became president of Peru. Not the first indigenous president we've had, but the first like rural indigenous president. Right? We've had an indigenous president before that went to studied at Harvard. We've had other indigenous presidents as well in the past, but none of them were like, I don't know, a union organizer and farmer. Right. So that created a lot of like quote unquote white panic in Peru. People started like leaving the country, like white people started leaving the country and moving to Europe or the United States, because they were scared of it, of him. Um, and he won the election. There was this huge campaign to try to invalidate the votes of Andean people, like indigenous people and people of indigenous descent in the Peruvian Andes, to try and rig the election so that he doesn't win, so that another person, preferably a white person, is president, not an indigenous person in Peru, because West is best. Right? So this group of like westernized, brainwashed elite Peruvians really pissed off the majority of the country that is either indigenous or of indigenous descent. In Peru, we would say they are mestizo, if they are mixed race, or like an indigenous population, like Quechua, Mara. You name it. And eventually, this president, like he wasn't the most democratic president we've had. He tried to stage a coup. He tried to close Congress, and so he was impeached because of it. I think rightly impeached. I don't support his attempt at closing Congress, but the indigenous population of Peru felt, well, he's not the first president to stage a coup, and when someone that you white guys like, they stage a coup and you let them, or he's not the first president to be corrupt. So why is it that when it's an indigenous person that is corrupt, then you want to apply the law to him? So we don't want to impeach him. We wanted to stay in power. I don't think that there was any way to legally keep him in power after trying to stage a coup in Peru. So, I mean, that wasn't going to work, but we at least needed to, hold new elections so that the new president that came had some level of legitimacy and was not, involved with the people that were trying to get rid of this president, who is our current president now, Dina Boluarte. And so they started protesting, saying, "We don't want you to impeach this guy. We want him to return. He's one of us." So what if he's corrupt and authoritarian? We've had a lot of white corrupt authoritarian presidents and nothing happened. So quote unquote, now it's our turn. The result was that these westernized white Peruvians who think West is best and who think these people live in the 17th century and think they are the reason why Peru is backwards, deployed the army and the police against these people and killed 50 protesters, 50 indigenous or indigenous descent protesters. 50 people died. No one went to jail. In fact, one of the whitest congressmen we have wrote a report saying that nothing illegal had happened. So there is an element to this idea that the West is best that is feeding into other parts of the world and creating a lot of harm. So it is troubling, right? This post-colonial theory understands this phenomenon with a notion called the coloniality of power. Coloniality of power is a term invented actually by a Peruvian, by Aníbal Quijano, which says that after the end of colonization as a political process, after the end of colonies, we pretend like that ended colonialism. It's as if, like, after the civil rights movement in the US, people pretend like racism stopped existing. Right? We fixed racism with Martin Luther King, right? It's the same. After colonization, then there's no more coloniality. And the response by Aníbal Quijano is, no, that is wrong. Colonization is a political process. But the uneven distribution of power in societies continues to exist even after colonization, because coloniality is an expression of the world order that was built as a result of the colonial encounter between Europeans and non-Europeans. So race became the organizing principle of world order. Everything flows from race, essentially. When Europeans encountered non-Europeans, they said, you're different. And they shifted away from their usual descriptors of who is us and who is them, from like, oh, they believe in several gods. This is Sylvia Wynter I'm quoting here. Maybe I can find her article somewhere. Hold on, let me see if I can find her article. So, yeah, here it is. I'm going to put this in the chat. So they went away from this idea of separating us from them in the form of, do you believe in one or two or many gods? Or I don't know, are you connected to this old religion or something or whatever? And the divider between who gets to be us and who gets to be them became race. So the entire world order was shifted towards an organization of racial hierarchies. And with this as the bedrock, when ways of knowing started to populate the earth, because we were everywhere, right? Confucianism was in Asia, or like Buen Vivir in like Kausai in Latin America. Different ways of understanding the world were presented to the world. The Western ones were deemed superior because they were the ones made by white people, and non-Western ways of knowing were left excluded. And we can see this in the silly examples, right? Like Brazilians say that they invented the airplane. Peruvians, we say that we invented the jet propulsion rocket. But it's the Wright brothers, right, that invented the airplane according to the established knowledge, right? It was not a Peruvian. It was not Pedro Paulet who invented the jet propulsion rocket. It was, I don't know who it was. So ways of knowing that are magic of, sorry, we don't say we invented the airplane. I apologize. Yes, I actually do believe that. I actually do think that. I do credit, Brazil with inventing the airplane. Santos Dumont de Andrade, of course, being the Brazilian who invented the airplane. Yes, Santos Dumont. I know. So in this ways of knowing thing that I'm describing, knowledge that comes from the West, that is quote unquote modern, is better. But this knowledge comes embedded with the idea of coloniality, with the idea of West is best. And so, because of this, the very dynamics of coloniality are embedded to power. Who has power? Those who control access to knowledge, those who control access to what is it that makes us human. And so, modernity slash coloniality is the dominant order in the world, according, of course, to decolonial theory, where West is best is the main rule. And so power is colonial in nature. Who gets power? Those that are at the top of the coloniality spectrum. That is what Quijano calls the coloniality of power. So post-colonial theory, and specifically in this case decolonial theory, totally anticipates this. This idea that the West is best is toxic. And I guess this is why people like Elon Musk hate decolonial theory, hate post-colonial theory. Because it sees through the ruse, I guess. The ruse of the West is best. Someone mentioned on Twitter, for example, I think it was Steve Klotnicki, who told me like, oh, but the West has the West is best because it has technological superiority. I was like, yeah, it's very funny to have technological superiority when you use potatoes to survive famines, gold from Latin America to sustain your economy, Asian spices to sustain your trade, black bodies to like do hard labor, indigenous bodies to do hard labor. You know, it's easier that way, right? So there is a sort of like a retrofeeding of this Western discourse of West is best that is very it's about this what is known in post-colonial theory as epistemologies of innocence and epistemologies of ignorance. I don't remember who it was that proposed this term. I think it was it Charles Mills? I think it was Charles Mills, but don't quote me on that. I might be wrong. This idea that like when we recall the history of the West, the coloniality of that history is sort of embedded into it. So it's not that slavery was bad and that was imposed by the West on Africa for reasons of racism. Is that, I mean, that was the way things were. It's a way of understanding the world that leads to you being able to excuse yourself from actually inventing slavery, or not inventing, but like imposing slavery on African people on account of their race, and inventing the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. So it is a way of knowledge that leads to your own justification of your own past, which is why we're in this war about the past in Europe. Like, was empire good? Is something that is being debated. Just recently, I think it was Alan Lester got into a fight with an assistant professor at Leiden over this, over whether empire was good. Right. But yeah, so I think it is important for us to like understand the world through the eyes of this idea that West is best is problematic, is a problem. It's not, it's sold as the solution to our problems. It's sold like if everyone were Western, if everyone were like us, then the world would be more modern.